often this question, and forgive me if I'm wrong, often this question comes up with regard to sort of Old Testament things like, it says don't wear clothes with mixed fabrics, or it says, don't mix milk and seafood together, yet we all go and have Thai food now and we don't worry about it. And then it seems like the church picks out bits of the Old Testament that do apply today, but it's rather a random process. I think that's a great question. When Jesus came, he was often in trouble with religious authorities for appearing to undermine the Old Testament regulation. And Jesus made it quite clear that he said, I haven't come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. So the purpose of the Old Testament law is to produce the community through which the Messiah would come into the world, through which God himself would enter history. And Jesus, in his life, utterly and perfectly fulfills the law, so that now, through him, we don't have to do that because we can trust in him. So when it comes to the Old Testament law, then, it does still seem that we're picking and choosing. And I think a helpful way of thinking about it was come up with by a theologian called John Calvin. I'm sure lots of you have heard of Calvin, but maybe not as a theologian. He was a theologian, and he was pretty bright. And when people discussed this in his era, he said, Jesus came to fulfill the Old Testament law, ceremonial. That's the whole temple system, everything about purity, all the stuff about cleanliness. He came to fulfill the civil law, the purpose for which a historical nation state, Israel, through a time which was going to produce the Messiah, and their civil law, which had a time limitation on it. And that means things like the penalties. If you do this, this will be the penalty in law. The civil law of the country, Jesus fulfills it. And the moral law, the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments and the other moral laws, Jesus fulfills in his person and he upholds in his teaching. So when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, when you look at the other teachings of Jesus, he's upholding very consciously the moral law of the Old Testament. So Christians, don't worry about the civil law or the ceremonial law, but we do, as we read the Old Testament, we read it through Jesus, who upholds the moral law.